السلام عليكم.
Assalamu alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. I would like first of all to thank the Arab Center and the Institute for Palestine Studies to organize this forum at a time when the acceptance of the reality as the status quo has become the norm, except, of course, the resistance heroes inside Palestine. After a day of very rich discussions, we come to the last session of today, and the ذاكرتي or my memory as a person who lived in the Gaza Strip are full of bitter memories about what happened in Gaza, and also before that the Palestinian divisions in the 80s and 90s, and the assault on the people leaving the mosque and the attacks on Gaza in the 90s until we reached the current situation 2007, which we suffer from the Palestinian division, can be the most bitter and impactful. With us we have Professor Mohammed Abu Nimer. He's a professor at the American University in the United States, and Dr. Lourdes Habash from BZ University, and Dr. Tamer Qarmout is an assistant professor at the Doha Institute. Because we are running late, I don't want to take too much of your time. I want to get into the interventions. I'll ask my colleague Dr. Qarmout. He will be talking about the article he published in Third World Quarterly. The floor is yours, Doctor. Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us. I would like to add my voice to say that it's really a cause for regret that we see this item on the agenda. We talk about Palestinian division at a time when our country is full of important events, and we hope we can reach an end to this division. My talk will be based on an article which was published recently in Third World Quarterly, and I want to comment on what Dr. Azmi said this morning. It was not easy in the past to publish this article in a Western journal, although Third World Quarterly is a progressive one, but it took a lot of time for my article to be published. So anyway, without any further ado, I'll get into the content of this qualitative research. With my team, we had in-depth interviews with groups of 20 people, all engaged in political activity from Fatah, Hamas, some people who took part in the failed attempts at reconciliation in Yemen, Doha, Cairo, and also representatives of the civil society and NGOs. And also the idea was this group is representative and it has in-depth information, because all that what we hear about this reconciliation attempts is what the media publishes, but we do not have inside or some of the taboos that we are confronting, uh, because I'll be speaking in Arabic and English. The main questions was based on open interviews, each interview duration of 45, focusing on three subjects. What are the roots of this Palestinian division, and why is it difficult to end, and why is it despite all the reconciliation attempt? The analysis method adopted is based on the responses of the respondents, so therefore it will be difficult to focus on the 80s only and not talk about the 70s and other. But this is some sort of a bias in this paper because all the politicians, technocrats, Hamas and Fatah talked about two critical junctions, Oslo and the Palestinian elections. But this does not reduce the importance of other importance, like the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and its impact on the Palestinian cause, but we'll start from the period before Oslo in about 4 or 5 years until recently, and because major changes after Oslo have occurred and there is a new track so the paper is moving in this direction. So far as the theoretical framework is based on, this was built after we ended the interviews, and I concluded that this was the best framework to tell the narrative. It talks about settler colonialism and historical institutionalism. It is superficial to talk about any Palestinian division without talking about the settler colonialism, because both main parties, Hamas and Fatah, have come into existence and also because they are the two main movements, so that we do not want to pay a lot of attention to other details without focusing on or looking through the perspective of the settler colonial state, so that we do not make the mistake of focusing on others. Today I hear the word settler colonialism many times, but there was a lot of repetition in the responses. The first feature of settler colonialism is the logic of the elimination of the natives, get rid of them by any cost. The second sign is not one event. 1948 started and it was the biggest catastrophe, but it has not ended. The attempts by the Israelis to neutralize the Palestinians and Judaize because settler colonialism is a structure. As we talk, Israel continues this policy to eliminate this people, its identity. It's a very important feature, therefore. The second important feature, which was rather sensitive, yes, we are Palestinians living under settler colonialism, which is very good. But the question of Palestinian native agency, what is our responsibility? Because settler colonialism interacts with the natives, so therefore we are responsible for what is happening now and the division we are witnessing. People blame Israel, that's fine, yes, but after Israel there comes a Palestinian responsibility, because there are decisions that we took as Palestinians, individuals and groups, which makes us responsible. The second important perspective, and is from the public policy, identity and political science, that is the historical institutionalism, meaning that Hamas and Fatah are two political parties and two institutions. Let's say Abu Mazen disappeared, Haniya disappeared. Will the behavior of people who succeed them will change? The paper says no, because the identity is there and the people cannot ignore the identity of the establishment. We talk about two parties or two institutions which developed under the Israeli occupation, and because of the critical junctions, each institution went in a separate, divergent track. Why is this theoretical framework important? Because, first of all, it shows that why these institutions or parties, in brackets, their decisions lead to them moving in separate tracks. The framework explains this. The second thing explains that inside each institution there are rules, practices, and narratives and practices. The members of Hamas and Fatah, they end up believing in rules and practices and the narratives engaged by the institution. Like, I'm from Fatah, I'm the revolution, and nobody else exists. The third important feature is, and that is the calculus approach and the cultural approach. Institutions, parties, political parties are institutions. They have their own internal calculations and internal culture, and this impacts their members. When we ask people why reconciliation is necessary and why is it failing, they say because the leaders are corrupt, they have their own interests, there's outside intervention, etc., etc. The final feature is the critical junctures, which we will focus on, or the outcomes of the interviews. All talked about critical junctures that the party or the institution fell into or contributed to, and therefore creating a different track than the other. This is very important. I know time is running out fast. This paper is big. I'm trying to summarize as much as I can. The themes indicate that there was unanimity that Israel has a basic and the most important role in the logic formation, because Israel's main concern is to cancel out all Palestinians. And we started with the point that Dr. Abu Asil, Dr. Ghassan has said that everyone is talking about the first tactic used by Israel between Hamas and Fatah and the Islamic complex in Gaza in order to create a rift between the Islamic movement and the PLO. So this started before Oslo process, and when Israel played the divide and conquer role. The interviews or there is unanimity that Oslo was a big trap and a big mistake that the Palestinians made or fell into. Oslo was a non-participatory peace agreement which was created behind closed doors at the time when there was an ideological division between Fatah and Hamas and other factions, and people were not even involved or known about it, because the late Yasser Arafat was non-participatory in his nature, and he did not have a mandate from all Palestinian. Dr. Maryam Abu Daqqa was a senior leader of the Popular Front Gaza was the biggest trap for the Palestinian cause. What happened before, after Oslo? I'll focus on the division between Fatah and Hamas. Also created a path. I'll try and summarize very quickly that there was very limited actual space. PA, well, the Yasser Arafat Authority, had a very limited. We know the division of the ABC. The Paris Protocol on the economy was very unjust. We did not, as the Palestinians, any ability to have our own independent economy. And also the closures imposed by Israel to really destroy the Palestinian economy and to impact the decisions by donors, Western donors who are biased towards Israel anyway. Also, other conclusions or the policies by Israel led to the weakening of the Fatah movement. Corruption was one big thing in the eyes of many participants. Shihab, a leader from Islamic Jihad, said the problem with the corruption continued and became more entrenched as time went on. So corruption was fed by Israel and the toleration of corruption with the ruling elite, the Palestinian ruling elite. So corruption and other elements of the Oslo package made Fatah have no longer an agency. Fatah's interest became dependent on Israel and the donors from the outside because of the impact of the Oslo Agreement. So therefore, as a political party or an institute, from the point of view rules, practices and narratives, Fatah has changed. Fatah after Oslo was different than Fatah before Oslo. Fatah has changed for good. This is so far as Fatah is concerned. So far as Hamas is concerned, the story is slightly different. Hamas used to go against Oslo and they was viciously resisted, but because of the pragmatism after they came to power, Hamas dealt pragmatically in order to avoid. Hamas had its weapons both in Gaza and the West Bank, and the late Ahmed Yassin were pragmatic and started accepting the PA as a reality. We know what happened in the Hebron massacre, in fact, because suicide operations started happening after this massacre, and then there was pressure from Israel on the PLO to curtail Hamas. So therefore, it was the first time that the PA... Okay, I'll do my best. Time is running out. Anyway, all these things led to Hamas was oppressed by Fatah, but Hamas's thinking changed into grassroots and being active in civil society because they did not want to be dragged into a civil war against Fatah. This is something which should be said about them because they matured from a resistance movement to a pragmatic political movement. So therefore, from the point of view of historical institutionalism, said Oslo created two things for Fatah and Hamas. For Fatah, for the first time, Fatah had international recognition, which it didn't have, and the PA, represented by Fatah, started sitting down with the Western countries, the US and others, and Fatah had financial financing, especially after the Gulf War. Hamas matured as a political actor, not just a resistance movement. Then we quickly moved to the second critical juncture. The second critical juncture, which is the Palestinian elections in 2006. Hamas won. This was a surprise. Of course, it wasn't a surprise really because Oslo was a failure, but when Hamas won in the elections, there were opportunities for the international community to deal differently with Hamas and sort of reach agreements. Immediately there was a boycott and sanctions, and the quartet also gave them impossible conditions, and the siege against Hamas was felt, and the first national unity government was faced with a lot of difficulties until Mahmoud Abbas dissolved it. The control of Hamas on Gaza. I cannot go through what the slide says. These are quotations which were given to us by the people against the quartet conditions. They all say the quartet was very unjust and Hamas should have been dealt with politically, but on the contrary, it was ignored and boycotted. What happened in 2007? Hamas moved from a resistance movement in 2007, became a ruling party. So Hamas as an institution began to change. So for the first time they felt the responsibility of governance. They changed their charter. They have a more pragmatic charter, recognizing implicitly the borders of 1967. But of course Israel did not recognize any of that. And the irony of the situation is Tony Blair was the one who fought Hamas through the quartet, admitted that we world leaders were wrong to adhere to yield to Israel's pressure after the elections. Hamas is a political Islamist movement, but it's a political movement. As we stand today, the split today, both have changed, Hamas and Fatah, as political parties. They changed from the inside. Their rules, narratives, and practices have changed. Fatah is totally limited by the constraints of legitimacy. It has very restricted agency. And Dr. Ahmed Yusuf said they say they have no mandate to do anything. They refer to the Americans and everything. Hamas controlled Gaza, but they repeated the same mistake by Fatah, like government jobs, employment, politicizing the civil service. 1 minute. What's even more important, Hamas in Gaza, we used to hear about something called the question of communication with Ramallah became an accusation of being spying. They do no longer look at Fatah and Ramallah as a political opponent, but a conspirer, as an enemy. This is very a low ebb, in fact. Finally, when everybody said that the PLO is dead and buried, which was another front for Mahmoud Abbas, but they all said they are our last resort. If any reconciliation is to succeed, the PLO should be revived and democratized. Finally, Palestinian reconciliation, in order for us to understand, there are factors which should be taken into consideration to bring the parties together. Israel is there, and the settler colonialism is very active because there is an interest in the status quo. There is a restricted agency. Neither Hamas nor Fatah have the ability to decide. Financing is a double-edged weapon, so therefore we as Palestinians do not have the ability to decide economically, and Hamas is ruling and they are happy with it because somebody is paying them. Fatah is the same. There is no incentives for either of them to sit down in the current reality. What happens? We don't know. We leave that to the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tamer. So, Dr. Tamer has covered a number of points, talked about the Oslo Agreement. He talked about this agreement as one of the most important parameters, particularly after the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza. He talked about the role that was played by a number of countries, and he said that I said that this division started in the 80s, but this is what I remember. Perhaps it started prior to that. This is what I remember from my childhood. I'm talking here about the first scenes that we used to see on television, the civil war in Lebanon, and so on. Anyway, before we give the floor to Dr. Lourdes, so we would like to say that Palestinians and some Arab countries try to make up the rift that existed and call upon the Palestinians to have negotiations. And there have been many agreements, many sessions, some of them in Doha, some in Cairo, some in Mecca, some in Algeria recently. But we cannot say that anything has been achieved or a real success has been achieved. We would like to give the floor to Dr. Lourdes, so who is going to present her presentation, so talking about the Palestinian project. So good evening to you all. I would like to thank the Arab Center and also the Palestinian Studies Institute for this very important annual Palestine Forum. Yes, it is true. There have been many attempts in order to find solutions, to reach reconciliation, to find solutions amongst Hamas and Fatah and between them. But when we look at the different articles, research papers with regard to reconciliation in Algeria, so these articles say that what is different when it comes to this particular agreement is that Palestinians appeared in the different pictures more. They were smiling more, they shook hands more, but this does not undermine the role that was played by other Arab countries. And as it was expressed by Dr. Tamer, talking about the occupation role and the division that was nurtured by the occupation. And we should not forget also what happens after every reconciliation agreement. Yes, exchange of smiles and shaking hands, and after that another exchange of accusations starts, and the reconciliation remains only ink on paper. So going back to the presentation that was made by Dr. Azmi Bshara. So I wanted here to concentrate on the reconciliation, and I would like to test it based on a number of theories to see how we would be able to reach different results when it comes to reconciliation based on the different theories. After I wrote this paper, I would like to tell you the conclusion. There is no possibility for a reconciliation in the short and medium term unless there are changes that would change the situation on the ground. So there should be a number of specific variables. These variables are known locally, regionally, and internationally. And of course, when we build the scenarios, there are a number of unexpected variables. But if these variables manifest, this would change the equation very, very deeply, such as the Arin al-Usud phenomenon, maybe if it covers the whole occupied territories, or to have an intifada similar to the one that happened in 1987. But in light of the current equation and the absence of real variables, reconciliation is not going to happen, at least to midterm. Some would describe this outlook as being pessimistic, but there are two lines and tracks of reading events on the ground. There is a realistic reading and a pessimistic or idealistic, in fact. I do not want to start from the standpoint of what we wish for, but we have to stand from what is realistic, despite the fact that I'm Palestinian, despite the fact that we all, as Palestinians, we wish that this division would come to an end because it has taken a lot from us. So there are some who have counted the number of times there have been attempts for reconciliation. Dr. Kayali talked about 16 attempts starting from the Cairo Declaration in 2005 until the agreement in Algeria. So we are still in the same vicious circle. So I would like to analyze and see what has happened, but I would like to talk about two main points and themes. So I am intellectually provoked when some talk about the fact that there is no reconciliation. There is no reconciliation because of a lack of a political will. This is an attempt to make the situation much lighter and not describe the real reason why this is happening, as if this is a normal situation. So that is why, instead of talking about political will, I have three concepts. So we're talking about the interests of a small group and also a conflict and an existential risk as seen by Fatah and Hamas. And third, the identity conflict as it was expressed by Dr. Tamer. These concepts has facilitated the task. So Dr. Tamer explained in detail some of those concepts. So when we talk about reconciliation, we talk about an agreement, about a Palestinian comprehensive project and not on a quota basis. So we do not want to divide the cake in the presence of the apartheid policies. So when we talk about the reconciliation, we were not even able to share the cake, let alone having a comprehensive reconciliation. I have two theories. So to have a kind of a comprehensive balance. And the second theory is the constructive theory. The first theory, which is the balance theory presented by Stephen David in order to understand the decisions, the behaviors of leaders in third world or the countries of the South, as I like to describe them. He talked about leaders that we cannot implement on them the theory that concentrates on external risks. Stephen Davids thinks that the real risk that leaders of third world country is due to divisions, conflicts, due due to weak states, all of these components would make the political system very weak. And as a result of that, if we implement that on both Fatah and Hamas, each one of them controls a geographical area that is controlled completely as leaders, and they set their priorities and policies in order to guarantee their presence in power. And this is very much apparent in the behavior of both parties. So the threat comes from the opposing Palestinian components. Each one of them claims that their Palestinian project is the right project for liberation, and that the other party, Palestinian party, tries to undermine the project in order to find a way out of occupation. And they consider their battle is a battle of existence that should be led and guaranteed in order for them to expand their influence and implement their national project. And here we talk about two components very boldly. We talk about these components, and also interest should be a national interest agreed upon, should be comprehensive, but in line of the division. This was substituted by a kind of a limited, very tight political party or partisan kind of view. And based on that, Hamas and Fatah play this zero-sum game, which entails that there should be one winner and one loser, and no room for joint and common gains for both parties. Fatah considers Hamas as threatening its presence and existence in the West Bank, and the opposite is also correct. So there are who have started seeing that from this perspective. So, since these are rulers ruling their own regions, areas, they should be held responsible. So, in order to tango, you need two. So, it takes two to tango. For a reconciliation to happen, we need the two parties, and the two parties are responsible irrespective of who is going to make more concessions or less concessions. Each one of them is responsible. These interests have deepened in light of the divisions that are happening in the Middle East, and here we have the objectives of staying in power that are in conformity with the objectives of other leaders in the Arab region who want to stay in their positions of power. And this agreement has reinforced the level of division. So also, I adopt a constructive theory where we try to analyze the reasons of conflict between Hamas and Fatah. Each one of them describes and introduces himself differently. Hamas describes itself as a national Palestinian movement. Hamas introduces and describes itself as an Islamic Palestinian movement. And this leads to many questions. Are we talking about the objective of establishing a state or the liberation of the whole of Palestine? And what are the objectives? Resistance or negotiations? So the items of reconciliation agreements refer that there are differences when it comes to details and mechanisms, and this does not reflect the essence of the problematic when it comes to introducing and identifying the project. So instead of having a comprehensive identity, a number of subsidiary and sub-identities have been established. So this conflict of identity is based on the exclusion of the other, lack of acceptance of the other. This conflict of identity has led to divisions, or coincides with divisions in the Arab region, the risk of Iran and Hamas and Fatah have joined these differences of trends that we see manifest in the Arab region. So this has led to the fact that the Israeli party has received a number or got a number of gains. And despite all what we have gone through as Palestinians, a retreat in the interest in the Palestinian cause, normalization of relations amongst Arab nations, the wars that have been waged on Gaza, the deal of the century, all of these are the result of the identity crisis and conflict, and this has led the two party not to see reality as it is and in an accurate way. This has led to a continuous conflict and lack of concessions. Each one of them wants a reconciliation with its own conditions. Fatah wants from Hamas to recognize the quartet. Hamas wants to reorganize the PLO. Each one of them wants to design reconciliation in a way it sees adequate. Either the other party would agree on everything or nothing. And going back to the quota system, that should not be the basis of any reconciliation. So I will finish in 2 minutes, yes. I would like to conclude by an attempt to read the different scenarios. As you know, the closest scenario that I have reflected in my introduction is the continuation of the status quo. We're going to continue with the divisions, smiling in front of cameras, and go back to the same situation in which we used to be. Hamas and Fatah prefer this scenario rather than losing their geographical areas that they control. If they have the chance to expand their geographical areas under their control, they would do that. But also, the continuation of division is essential for Israel, and the occupation supports division in addition to the US and the EU, who want Palestine to remain divided. They do not want a national government, and this is going to lead to 2006. And what was rejected in 2006 is not going to be accepted today. And this lead to the deterioration of the political situation inside Palestine, and not indicating and reflecting that Israel is the real threat. So the radical scenario, if there are unexpected changes, an intifada or armed resistance, this is going to force the Palestinians and Fatah and Hamas would be forced to work together because they would be forced as a result of the changes that would have come to the surface. So in this scenario, the international community would not accept that. It would try to impede the situation very clearly. So the third scenario, so the control of one of the two political parties, either through elections or by force, elections on the area controlled by that party. So this can lead to a worse scenario that would be worse, which is a civil war. So in the scenarios that I have mentioned, the political parties in Palestine are small, the other political parties, and they would not be able to impose a new reality on the two main political parties and force them to achieve reconciliation. So they won't have the upper hand or even an influence even to achieve quota. So the civil society makes many attempts, even if they have launched the quote that says the people want the division to end, but they were not able to force the two political parties. I think what would force the two parties is to have unprecedented incidents. At the end of the day, it is the homeland that has made these political parties and not the opposite. If Hamas and Fatah continue as they are doing now, they're going to gain in the mid and short terms. But at the end, this is going to lead to a loss, as it has happened with regard to the Palestinian political parties in the 40s of the 20th century. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Many points have been underlined We see a lot of pessimism in the scenarios that have been proposed. So either situation stays as it is, or to have a Palestinian intifada that would unite Hamas and Fatah. And the third solution is to have the control of one party on Hamas or Fatah. And this can lead to a civil war. We hope that we would have a much more optimistic scenario manifest. Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimer. We cannot hear the gentleman. He is speaking off microphone.
دقيقتين ثلاثة قبل الموعد يعني تأخير من الآن؟ لا مش تأخير. مساء الخير.
Good evening. I know that I am the last speaker after 35 maybe speakers, male and female, and you have heard many analyses, many conceptualizations, theories, political science theories, and so on, and scenarios pertaining to the different topics. I'm going to alleviate that, and the two presentations before me were excellent. The first speaker talked about the division, and the lady speaker talked about her own analysis from a theoretical perspective. And I'm going to give you something fresh from the oven, something even incomplete. Talking about division and what is the language that is used in order to describe the division that is happening on the ground. So this is in confirmation of what my colleagues have expressed in a from a theoretical perspective. So introduction, there are so many articles, analyses that have been written. So a great deal has been written about this topic from the perspective of political science, psychology, sociology, from different standpoints. And many authors have written on this particular topic. There are some who are for reconciliation and some others who are against reconciliation. Many of them have a gloomy viewpoint saying that no reconciliation is going to happen. This is, of course, depending on the motive and the agenda of the author or writer. There is a small number of research papers that have started from the standpoint of reconciliation. I wrote on reconciliation in Ireland, South Africa. I have been teaching this topic for 20 years, even between husband and wife, when there is a disagreement. We talk about something that is much deeper than quota. We're talking about a kind of a transformative reconciliation. There are preconditions for a reconciliation to happen. And I wanted to see, is this the nature of reconciliation that we want to have amongst Palestinian factions, or are they talking about something else and they call it musalaha? Or we try to hide certain things and do not try to include. So we cannot talk about reconciliation in the presence of occupation. I think reconciliation should not be included in this story. So when we talk about quota or a political agreement, perhaps would be the term. But when we talk about reconciliation, people tend to stop believing that any of the leadership would have the intention to achieve reconciliation. So we asked youth from a number of Palestinian universities to see if really they look at the situation as such, taking into account people who have been martyred and so on. Is there anybody who talks about martyrs and so on? So I started this topic in last week of December, and we have had a number of interviews that have been made with different peoples. So political reconciliation based on the transformative components. So there should be a review of the relationship. There should be a recognition, and also a recognition that each party is to be held responsible vis-à-vis what has happened, and also to recognize that there are victims, and also to know what compensation is going to be presented. So in Ireland, reconciliation came to a halt because they were not able to decide the compensation, Catholics, Protestants, and so on. So also when it comes to reconciliation, who should be responsible, who should be held responsible, and there should be guarantees not to have the same scenario once again after reconciliation. So for a serious reconciliation to happen, institutions, educational institutions, media institutions, economic, cultural institutions, they should not work in the same institutionalized system. A deep reconciliation would require more than what we can achieve. And in our history, there aren't any reconciliations in keeping with these conditions. So the components of reconciliations, as I have expressed, do not exist. We do not have any prior experiences. We have some tribal reconciliations, but perhaps this is not something that should be mentioned here, but those who have been killed, we're talking about 322 Palestinians have died, 236 in Gaza, and the rest in the West Bank. So the infighting exists. It exists in the history of Palestine also. There have been incidents also. So why have we closed the chapter? No. And we insist to use the term reconciliation in other circumstances. So who is impeding reconciliation, and what is the cost? What is the impact? What is the role of CSOs? Are there any reconciliation initiatives in the last 15 years? And in your view, what can lead to reconciliation? The Palestinians are not the only people that have divisions amongst them. We have in Sri Lanka, we have between the LTT and the Tamil, in Ireland, between the IRA and Sinn Féin group. So there have been differences in South Africa. There have been divides and differences even amongst the Gandhi non-violent movement, and also between Martin Luther King and the others. So why would we use this as justification in order not to have a liberation project for the Palestinians? So we as Palestinians, we should not use this as a justification to have one recipe, one formula, and only formula that should be dealt with and used. But let's continue. So we have met 7 focus groups, 26 female, 28 male. So we have had university students, 27. We have had also journalists. We have 2 age groups, 18-25 and 25-30 and 30 plus, and 5 from above. And we had people from the West Bank, 46 from Gaza. We had 8. So we had 10 interviews, 7 males, 3 female. So this has happened in December and January, and I would like to talk about the results and highlights. So there is a wide agreement amongst youth. So yes, they said that there is division, and we had two groups. Each one of those groups has its own territory, and the cost is the Palestinian Liberation Project. This is the cost. And the leadership in both territories have set a political, economic, and security structures that aim for self-protection and perpetuate the existing status quo with Israeli occupation. So each one is being held responsible for that. So there is another point. So each many of them talked about leaders trying to protect their positions. That is why no it is not surprising that we have heard such comments, whether this when they talked about Hamas or about Fatah. So also some talked about the fact that there is no serious attempt for reconciliation, and also the president also is not serious when it comes to reconciliation, because this is going to be inimical to the interests of both groups. So what is also impeding the relationship with the diaspora that tries to contribute to this process. And what is more important is the first and second components. There is a kind of a demoralized number of Palestinian youth and community activists, and they do not trust the discourse. And we know that the division between Hamas and Fatah in the past 2 decades supported greatly Israeli military domination and political propaganda outside with foreign Europeans and Americans. So also there has been a level of discredit amongst the two groups. So you remember those who have not lived the first Intifada, and some of them did not know much about the second Intifada. So there is a necessity for reconciliation. So a division would have an impact, and all the initiatives are political papers, and we need to have a real solution, political solutions. We do not need a kind of a parachuted solution coming from above or from far away. So we need to have a kind of a comprehensive kind of reconciliation amongst all members. Unfortunately, the Palestinian communities have not been able to mobilize. So So this does not mean that there is a lack of desire for reconciliation, but some fear the security and what the security would do. So this was one of the results that we got. So reconciliation is not going to be effective as long as it is linked to tribal origin. So the solutions should come from the street. So when we talk about the reconciliation, we have to know what the solution is. Is it a continuation of Oslo? Is it more concessions? If it is the case, we do not want to have reconciliation. But if reconciliation is going to reinforce further our constants, particularly in the light of the attacks that is happening on our people by Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders. So it is not a matter of factions, it is a national project matter. So those who blamed Hamas more said that Hamas accepted the 1967 borders, yet they continue to speak about the 1948 and full armed resistance. And many talked about the position of power, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank. So once again, they underlined that Hamas accepted 1967 as a de facto, but they still do not want to deal with the situation on this basis, and dissolving the authority as a system was the only alternative, and that can uh, lead us to find a solution. So those who want to support the Palestinian people should stand in a balanced way in dealing with both groups. They should stand from the same standpoint. And some also expressed their despair from leadership. One from Hebron said that we need perhaps a wise dictator. So even if the leader is the dictator, at least should be wise. Because we do not believe in pluralism. He said we do not need to talk about democracy because for us there won't be any adequate solution for the current situation. So the division has led to a gap amongst youth, has led you to the fact that they do not want to delve into political life, and this has led to a real division amongst youth and also a lack of communication amongst youth in both Gaza and the West Bank. If we look at the settlement today, this is something that is expanding, and we have contributed to the expansion of settlements. This is one of the responders who sees that so many have contributed to the expansion of settlements. So is there an expansion? So were they able to enter the Palestinian fabric? So to what extent they were able to penetrate the social fabric of Palestine? Some think that the divide is very deep, and some say that this situation now is even more difficult than 1967 and 48. So this is one of the most important factors that have been inimical to the liberation movement. So in one of the focus groups, they identified the depth of the division, which is reflected. So also there is a deep divide, and not due to the fact that they belong to this faction or that faction, but because of the role also of the tribes and clans, and the impact of the clan and the tribe would have an impact and an influence on extended families. I really liked the description that was made by the student talking about the impact and influence of patriarchal systems top now down, and the view or my view is not taken into account when a patriarchal system is undertaken. Also, we have avoidance. So I just need 1 minute. So many try to avoid talking about the subject. We disagree as a family, we disagree as members of the family, as friends, as brothers, and there is nothing to talk about. But some others say that we do not need to talk about these things because we are united. And whenever we have a martyr, we unite ourselves. And they would talk about the martyrs in Jenin, in Hebron, and how all of them have met and unified their ranks. And some say that they should not talk about this division. So. So there is another view that says if you do not earn your living, you cannot be in charge of any decisions. Some say that the situation is similar to Bab al Hara, and we were very much encouraged at the beginning, but the situation is fading away. So the series of Bab al Hara and reconciliation as a series, there is no trust in the leadership. There is nothing that we can talk about. So in conclusion, there is no mention of the victims. Nobody talked about the victims. And nobody expects that a transformative reconciliation might take place. It is not expected, and there should be a kind of a popular movement and not from the leaders that already exist. So there is disempowerment, disengagement from the leadership. There is dismissal and cynicism. But at the same time, they say this is not civil war. So why are you exaggerating? At the end, so what has happened is a clear indication is that the security measures by both Hamas and Fatah, they do not allow journalists, students to talk about any dynamism when it comes to this particular subject. Thank you very much. Yes, there is resistance, yes. The speakers do not want to leave the microphone. They will not want to let go of the microphone. We have only half an hour. We're going to start with the questions from here. Thank you very much. Very important and interesting lectures. I have a question that I would like to pose to Mrs. Lourdes Habash and the two other speakers as well. When we talk about Oslo, we describe Oslo as a catastrophic agreement. There are who compare Oslo to a second Nakba. There are those, most Palestinians are convinced of that. They say that Oslo conceded 78% of Palestinian territories, has redefined the strife as terrorism and violence. Oslo was very much enigmatic, unclear when it comes to what the Palestinians want, and was very clear as to what the Israelis want. All those who criticize Oslo, they do not talk about who contributed to Oslo, who signed Oslo. So they criticize the crime, but they do not talk about the criminal. So from a logical and a scientific perspectives, why is this happening? Thank you. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I would like to thank the speakers talking about this sensitive topic, but I would like to comment from an intellectual perspective. So the speakers talked about the theoretical framework, and I think there is a strategic perspective that should be taken into consideration in my own personal conviction. So Oslo has established a political entity that did not exist in the past, which is the Palestinian Authority, which holds or carries a security role. And here we have seen a difference when it comes to the strategic level. So the real root of disparity and difference is that there are contradictions between two strategies that are different from each other and that cannot meet. And consequently, there cannot be any reconciliation. So there is a strategy that leads to either security agreements or resistance. So that is why there cannot be any reconciliation. I agree when you said that. And the byproduct is the problems of the elections of 2006 and so on. These are the byproducts. And as you have mentioned, you talked about the preservation of existence, and each one has its own entity that it wants to protect, and each one of them has tried to enter into the realm of denial and undermining the strategy of others. And they say, no, we're not talking about these things, and there is resistance and so on. And Hamas, the same thing. So they keep on talking about Oslo and the 2006, and they want to go contradictory to Oslo. And this would not work. So, to be brief, I think that there is a third scenario that can be the solution, since reconciliation cannot reach any solution through to the radical changes in the two strategies. I think that the third strategy that can be proposed is the Palestinian people outside in diaspora and inside Palestine, in order to set a liberation movement that goes beyond the factions, for the factions not to be the only representative of the liberation attempts. There should be a national liberation movement and would put the factions in the right size. And here they would say, yes, we are 7 million outside and 6 million inside, and 1 million perhaps belong to two factions, but we have 6 million that are not part of any of the two factions. And here we can have a certain kind of dynamism that would not lead to reconciliation, but a new kind of Palestinian entity or representation that would take us away from the problems of these two factions. Thank you very much. Ali Hashani from Algeria. So I was intellectually provoked, and I do apologize. I want to take 4 to 5 minutes. Algeria has never used the diplomacy of microphones when it comes to the different factions, including Western Sahara. So the Algeria Charter did not come from void. It was a wealth for a historical revolution after the Chinese and Russian revolutions. And I want to remind you of the resistance of Ahmed Bey and Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi when you said that Fatah has its own territories and Hamas has its own territories. We have lived the same circumstances with the two resistance, the resistance of Ahmed Bey and the Emir Abdel Qadir, and Algeria was able to get its independence. Algeria never had any relationship with the Israeli entity. So Algeria also worked in order for Palestine to have a complete membership in the United Nations. The Algerian president always reminds us of Palestine and reminds us of the outcome of the Algerian Charter. So Algeria always tries to preserve the dignity of Palestinians against any normalization of relations. So you have any questions? So they provoked me. So the Algeria Charter is only a 4-month charter. So I really hoped if the Dr. Lord had been able to listen to Algerian analysts talking about this particular topic. Mohammed Al-Ansari. Dr. Mohammed. So You mentioned that both parties are not truthful when it comes to reconciliation. And also, the sponsor is very important when there are two parties that are in animosity. But there is a party that tries, in a all neutral way, tries to propose solutions. Dr. Tamer, you mentioned a number of factors that would lead to solutions and why the Palestinian people have said their words. So Dr. Wael talked about liberation. Why do we insist on only Hamas and Fatah with all respect to any strife? So So, if the two parties are not in agreement, why wouldn't we give the floor, give the opportunity to the people to resort to the ballot box, and then we see a solution? And there is another point where I disagree with you. When you mentioned at the beginning and you said when the leader of Hamas and the leader of Fatah are no longer there, the situation is going to continue as it is. No, reconciliation was in the hands of one person, which is Mahmoud Abbas, the president. So he decides when the reconciliation starts and when it stops. And there are documents, there are facts, there are statements, and you would be able to see. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to be very brief. Anwar Taha. So the division is going to continue because putting an end to this division is not up to the Palestinian will. What we do not know is that Israel decides and has a say when it comes to Palestinian reconciliation. The PA has signed Oslo. This is an international agreement with international guarantees. But this PAA has created institutions with political security and economic interests that cannot be dismantled unless Israel agrees. And also the same applies to Gaza. So this is the first point. The second point is a conflict when it comes to the representation of Palestinians. And as a result of that, the rounds of rebuilding the PLO have not been successful. Before the elections, they want to rebuild the PLO through the elections, and this was not successful, in my view. So let the division continue. But what is important is to manage our disagreements, to know how to disagree, because we cannot see a situation where there is no disagreement, and also to continue engagement with the occupying forces, because this is the one that would lead to the establishment of our new project. Tawfiq Haddad from Jerusalem. So I would like to speak in English now.
Palestinians would love to have a united political structure. But the truth of the matter is there's institutional pluralism. We have different ideological, political backgrounds, frameworks. It's not wrong to have pluralism, okay? The problem was that they basically created national structures, but at the same time, the means of facilitating these national structures was not there. Israel stayed in control of entrance and exit, and they also controlled the money. Okay, so this led to a dynamic where everybody was trying to defend their own best interests and ensure their institutional existence. And by the way, Fatah and Hamas were not the only ones who did this. The liberals did this, the left did this, so there was no exception to this. And this is not something that can change, because at the end of the day, unless you come up with alternative funding, unless you can solve the security issue in Israel's entrance, Israel controls the commanding heights of the situation. And that is what is the problem here. And the fact is, a lot of this discussion was within some liberal model that as though the international powers would allow for some national reconciliation so the Palestinians could be able to pull all their powers together in one institution. ما بصير هالحكي. They would break it, they would crack it. In the end, they wanted a collaborator government out of the Palestinians. They actually didn't get that. They got a broken up, pluralistic Palestinian institutional setting. And it's not great. We certainly operate underneath our power, but we're still alive. And everybody going according to their own tactics and strategies. The only way out of this is not an internal debate between Fatah and Hamas. The only way out of it is to hasr hisarak, what Mahmoud Darwish says, to create an alternative power that encircles Israel and the donors, and that is only done by a radical movement in the Arab world as well as in the West, which isolates Israel and would facilitate Palestinian unity from within.
شكرا دكتور.
محمد أبو زيني أستاذ الاقتصاد في معهد الدوحة. بعد الشكر للمحاضرين.
So after thanking the speakers, I had a question that I wanted to pose on the three speakers here. So the question here, so talking about division, this is not something new. So we do remember that the Palestinian project started in a divided way, and throughout history, and without taking too long, there has always been division. I remember when we read history, so moments of national unity, these were limited moments, and we always had different fronts and also opposition forces. So there has always been divisions. So the national leadership and so on, when did it exist? When there was a resistance project. So these have been formed as unique projects when the Intifada existed. So when there is a national project at its height, there is unity, there is national unity, but very simply, when there is no resistance project, there is division. This has always been the case. The different fronts, Fatah, even before the birth of Hamas. The only difference now is that there are authorities and institutions, and perhaps this has a huge weight. So what is your view when it comes to that? Is that reconciliation is the exception and division is the rule? Thank you. Thank you very much for your valuable interventions. Thank you for your efforts. Ali Mouassi, I think it is necessary to see the differences within Hamas and Fatah because there are discussions taking place in order to cover this matter, which is division. So it is also important to know the different players from other factions because they contribute to the formation of the new reality that we have. There's another point. We have had a number of sessions about the different situations that have come to the surface even prior to the division, and we have the Karama strife that says very clearly that the Palestinian people does not talk about division in the street, and that the Palestinian people, they go beyond division and they were able to unify themselves within a certain agenda of discourse that would lead it to take to the streets, going beyond the authorities and their centers in order to confront colonialism. And as a result of that, the Palestinians in their practices, they have gone beyond that, so beyond division, and we should not ignore this point. There is another point when it comes to youth. We are talking here about the majority of the Palestinian people that are neither the power of Hamas nor Fatah. it is incumbent on us when we talk about youth. We have to read what youth says in diaspora in the 1948 territories in Jerusalem in order to understand how this youth has gone beyond the situation of division in order to find alternatives that would unify them. During the Karama, dynamism and strife, and Benfir talked about another strife, and that security cooperation is going to be much tighter, much ferocious. So my first intervention, so to Dr. Tamer, it is necessary we as Palestinians, first and foremost, we have to take into account the terminology used. So there have been, so when you talk about the different suicide operations, so we should mention things and call a spade a spade. So this is the right of resistance. This is something that is guaranteed by the United Nations. Any nation under occupation has a guaranteed right, which is armed resistance. The second point, the second part of my intervention is to do with what Dr. Lord had said. There is a fourth scenario. I was surprised that none of you talked about elections as a scenario. So let the people, the Palestinian people, go to the ballot and decide if we think that the two strategies are the reason why we are in a situation of loss. Let's resort to the ballot. My salutations to you all. Osama Rushdie from Egypt. All what has been presented, all the papers have ignored the Arab regime. And I think that the actors, they do not move in a vacuum, and this reflects the Arab situation. We have heard what has been linked Mubarak insulting Arafat and forcing him to sign, and the lack of guarantors when it comes to what had been signed. And we have seen the Brexit when Britain wanted to change the situation. Europe stood very, very strong and forced Britain to sign and respect the protocol because it is a guarantor of peace in Ireland. So there were guarantors of those agreements that are being implemented. So the Arab system, the forces around the Palestinian cause are one of the reasons that stand between reconciliation and the implementation of reconciliation, because it is not in keeping with what Israel wants. Thank you very much. Dr. Abu Bakr from Al-Najah University, 3 questions. The first question, as I understood from the speakers at the podium, is that reconciliation was born dead and therefore it cannot be revived. So should we wait? And time is the only way to go beyond division. We have been going through many difficulties, and the Arab transformations, the regional and international transformations, can they lead to going beyond the division that is taking place inside Palestine? Hussein Al-Shugrani from Marrakesh, Morocco. I have 3 questions to Dr. Lourdes Habash. So since I'm talking within the theories of international relations, so I would like to rub shoulders with your ideas. You talked about the zero-sum game. You talked about the realistic theory, and I have methodological and scientific questions. But in content, I have no problem whatsoever. So the first question, we cannot put together the constructive theory and the zero-sum theory. So we cannot put them together. When it comes to the realistic theory, we have to clarify between that there is the Morganto theory, particularly in his book, and Kenneth Waltz, who talked about new realism, talking about economic factors that have an impact, and you talked about the actors. The state, as Kenneth Waltz is concerned, it is the one that changes the structure of international system. That is why Hamas and the other national movements, would they impact the regional system? Hence, Morgato differentiate between the political phenomenon from other phenomena. This is also a problematic. So you moved to other scenarios, and you mentioned 3 scenarios, either infighting and so on and so forth. When we talk about scenarios, I do not think that they are part of the realistic or the constructive theories. That is why, if you can kindly talk about the 3 scenarios within the black swan theory. So the incidents are not expected. That is why we need to shine light on them. I want to start with what Dr. Mohammed had said, Majid Abu Salama. The first thing, with regard to the academic methodology that has been used, I am surprised when you talk about division, you talk a lot about Gaza. I am from Gaza, and we have an experience with the different movements, youth movements. So the different movements that were against division, many of them and many strong movements exist in Gaza. And also we have to take into account those who are working for the division, are trying to entrench the division. We as youth, I hope that you would be able to integrate this viewpoint, to integrate these youthful movements. I was part of many of those movements in the last 15 years. We have seen conscious efforts made by youth. A huge price has been paid for these efforts. I felt that there is a problem when it comes to the sponsor. Those who fund both parties. So when we talk about the West imperialist societies, we talk about the social democrats, we talk about the alliances in which Fatah exists that protect Fatah and in their political work in Europe. As a person working in Europe, I feel that most of our problems in Europe, particularly in the last decade, these are problems that we're talking on with the Social Democrats, and these underline 2 main points. The importance of having Fatah to serve the existing agenda. And there are agendas that are imposed and that impede the reconciliation. Also, we have the Zionist lobby and the impact of the lobby, and the idea that also I would like to underline. So how can we build a different structure to the structure that already exists? So we, in my view, are no longer able to build new structures. So we describe a kind of a situation, a state, without trying to analyze it very deeply. We need to go beyond the situation in which we are to build a new situation. I really apologize. One second. The Palestinian Agency, particularly when it comes to conflict solutions. I talked and I worked on mediation in Switzerland. Switzerland, they do intervene in what is happening. So what is really annoying is that there are no Palestinian experts in these spaces. So last intervention.
خلاص بس باختصار لو سمحت باختصار
Very briefly. So the problem is that my name is Anas Al-Hajj. The ceiling of expectations from reconciliation is very high. So we need to reduce the demands and expectations. If we do that, we can reach a solution. So Ismail Haniya and Mahmoud Abbas, they appear in front of media, kiss each other and say that this is reconciliation. This cannot happen. We need to have less expectations. And perhaps the current situation would be great. It is great to have such divisions sometimes because Gaza was able to build an army in the absence of Abbas authority, and Abbas was able to live his life in the West Bank without impacting others. So reconciliation in itself would not be useful to us and adequate. Thank you very much, Mr. Anas. So in the Palestinian case, we have certain reactions. I do apologize anyway. I would like to say three things. Far away from the theoretical perspective, constructive or zero-sum perspective, we have a structural issue. So most of the people who have taken the floor did not announce and say they belong to which party. I am a leader in Fatah and I am responsible for what I'm going to say now. Far from the zero-sum or structural constructive crises, we have a structural problem. So it seems that those leaders, they belong to an age that has come to an end. So the two parties in this equation, both of them do not want to recognize the powers that have come to the surface. So it is not possible to achieve any change if we do not know the components of the Palestinian society. So when it comes to reconciliation, so parties go. So reconciliation was not born dead. National liberation cannot achieve independence without taking into account unity. Yes, we have two contradictory programs, but the people are not led through those strategies. They have to find commonalities in order to achieve one strategy for the Palestinian people. The second point that I would like to talk about, they go to reconciliation in order to compliment those who have invited them. So they do not go because they have a will and they want to achieve reconciliation. That is why reconciliation is not the responsibility of Fatah or Hamas. It is the responsibility of the Palestinian people who have to create something that would lead two parties to reconciliation. So the historical mistake is that we have given less importance to so many things. We have to adopt the option of resistance, and the only way that would lead to that is through elections. Thank you very much. So the idea, as I have heard Dr. Azmi had said, is to gather Palestinian minds to give them the opportunity to discuss, and I think that my colleagues will not have time to comment. But they would have enough time to talk in corridors and to answer the questions. Dr. Tamer, go ahead. First of all, thank you very much for your questions, the excellent questions. Each question needs and deserves to be tackled at great length. Very, very short comment. I would like to comment on the questions and not observations. The observations are beautiful. All respect to you, the gentleman from Egypt. Egypt has a say when it comes to persuading Hamas. If there is a green light from the West and so on, the same applies to Jordan. If there is an international Jordanian-Egyptian agreement to push the parties to find a solution, they would do that. We do not exclude the other political parties. Hamas and Fatah are leading not because they have been elected to do so. They do that as a result of the weapons they have, forces. So the other factions are only kind of mosaic. So there is no opposition in Gaza, nor there is any opposition in the West Bank. Thank you very much. All respect to your ideas and opinions, Doctor. Go ahead. I would like to start with the Algerian brother. We criticized ourselves and we did not criticize other countries. You misunderstood me. The problem is not our problem and not the problem of other countries. When it comes to the theoretical engagements, I talked about two theories, the omnibalance theory and constructive theory. I did not use the zero-sum theory. I used only the omnibalance theory. When I built the scenarios, I did not build them on the scenarios, on the theory. And thank you for the piece of advice. There are so many scenarios, but what I saw can be perhaps the closest part of my own personal and subjective perspective, which is part of the calculations. And the scenarios they were built on expected and unexpected components. When we talk about the scenario of elections, this is one of the important elections. This scenario is part of the conflict between Hamas and Fatah. Resorting to the people through elections, this is something that is feared by both parties because none of the two parties wants to concede the geographical area. I would like to thank you for your interaction. We can continue with the discussion afterwards. Thank you. Thank you very much. Because of the short period available, we did not stop at the sponsors. There are so many sponsors, internal and external. So this is a sensitive matter. This is a very, very sensitive matter. And so many fear talking about this topic. So we keep on talking about unity discourse. So as if you talk about this matter, no resistance is going to be there. So when the youth talked about the matter, they didn't say that they did not want to have any resistance. I would like to give you 4 practical examples. The division impacts. You go to Turkey, you pay 1,600 through Jordan and 500 through Tel Aviv. So if you want to marry whose family from Hamas, you cannot do so. If you want to marry somebody from Fatah, you cannot do so that. If you have an uncle from Hamas or Mansaf, Hamas or Fatah, you cannot meet them. If you want to be employed, they need to know you belong to whom. So this is a practical matter. We feel it in our day-to-day life. We talk about how to manage conflict and division in a way that would lead to a liberation project on a minimal commonalities. We have not been able to achieve that, but still, we cannot say that this is not impacting us as a community. Yes, this is impacting us and very deeply. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank my colleagues.
شكرا جزيلا. نستكمل النقاش إن شاء الله في البهو الخارجي.